Hey everybody, I'm Bryan, aka The Terrible Australian of Supermastery.com, and welcome to my video review of the Dalton Trumbo biopic Trumbo. So let's get right into it. Now, I'm kind of partial to films that are about Hollywood. I mean, if it's a film about about the Hollywood system, or how films are being made, and just anything about Hollywood in particular, it's definitely going to appeal to me, because since, being a big fan of films since I was a kid and right up to now, films that are about Hollywood are always I just find really interesting and fascinating. And maybe it's because it just gives me kind of an insight into how Hollywood works, and sort of how people sort of depict it in so many ways, whether it be sort of a good way or a bad way. To me, it's always a really interesting sort of topic, at least to me, to watch as a film. So when it came to the film Trumbo, I knew a bit of Dalton Trumbo. I know he'd written so many great films in the past, Spartacus being one of those in particular, which is an utterly fantastic film and one of the greatest films ever made. So I didn't really know that much about him, and I knew that he was one of the sort of the main sort of writers who was on the Hollywood blacklist. And to me, the Hollywood blacklist sort of events and all that, I find really interesting as well, like how that whole situation sort of came about with the sort of like the communist witch hunts of the 50s and 60s and whatnot. So anything like that, it's just really interesting to me. So in a way, I was definitely looking forward to Trumbo, which definitely, since this film kind of covers all those elements and all that, it definitely was one that I was really interested in checking out. And of course, it's directed by Roach, who of course is the director behind films like the Austin Powers films, Meet the Parents, The Campaign and whatnot. But to me, this film is definitely more in line of, say, the films that he's kind of made for HBO, like Recount, Game Change, where there's sort of more sort of biopic slash kind of films that look at real events. And this film is definitely more along the lines of that. And I have to say that while I don't think it's an amazing film by any means, but I did really enjoy this one a lot. I thought there are some really good elements about it that I really like. I thought it was a really interesting sort of story that sort of explored Dalton Trumbo's life, since, I wasn't really, other than sort of some of the films that he wrote, I wasn't really all that familiar to him as a person. So this film sort of at least kind of gave me a bit of insight to who he was as a person, and sort of made me even more interested to read up more about him afterwards, and as well as sort of what happened during that time. But at the same time, though, as enjoyable as the film is, it does sort of take a very sort of kind of a very simplistic approach to these events and whatnot, because you can tell it sort of does it in a way that that's not too in depth or anything like that, so that people who aren't aware. So it doesn't really sort of dive into all the events that happened during that time in too much depth. And in a way, it sort of approaches it in a very simple way. Not to say that's a bad thing, but I kind of wish there was a little bit more to it. So in a way that kind of sort of dug into it, so they can explore this, to me, this really interesting topic in a way that is more interesting and whatnot. But overall, there are some good qualities. Other than, I thought the cast all did pretty well with what they're given. Some cast members were better than others and whatnot, but they all do a pretty solid job with all their work, and everyone does pretty well in their portrayals of the real life people that they're playing. Except for, say, I guess Louis C.K., because his character was actually written specifically for the film, and is actually an amalgam of a bunch of actual screenwriters that Dalton Trumbo was friends with at the time. So they kind of took all those elements of different screenwriters and put them into this one character, which that kind of aspect I always found interesting, but that's a whole different topic altogether. But in terms of playing Trombone himself, I thought Cranston did a really good job. He's always been a great actor, and it was really cool to kind of see him in this role and playing this sort of really interesting guy who you just kind of find really fascinating and whatnot. And the film does a really good job of sort of portraying his sort of life, both as a screenwriter and as an activist and a family man as well. And it does it in a pretty good way that I found quite solid. And it's pretty well written as well. Like I said, it's a bit, the script I could have I felt could have explored some aspects a little bit more. But for the most part, it's pretty decent, and it's solidly directed as well by Jay Roach. Although I have to admit, though, I suppose this is probably due that the film was like a $15 million film, but I did feel like the visually the film kind of looked more like a TV film at times rather than a theatrical cinematic type, more of a cinematic type film, because it kind of feels like this film would have played even better more on the small screen rather than, say, the big screen. Because it's sort of like, yeah, sort of visually, it just was kind of a bit, like, even though it's well directed, like, the direction is pretty solid, I think visually it just kind of has this sort of very kind of flat feel to it, and I kind of wish there was a bit more of a, sort of a bit more style to it. And Jay Roach has that in him, like, even though he's directed sort of comedies and all that in the past, but he always brings sort of an interesting, but they always have a bit of a style to them that sort of, that feel like sort of that feels cinematic. This one in particular doesn't quite feel like that at all, and it feels more like, you know, his HBO films. Although I would argue his HBO films, like, actually are probably more cinematic than Trombone is, but, you know, but I digress. So, but overall, yeah, I think overall, like, it's not a perfect film by any means, and of course there's also some aspects that are pretty inaccurate to aspects that actually did happen at the time. But I think as a film on its own, I thought it was a pretty solid, pretty compelling film nonetheless. And to me, it was an interesting sort of history lesson, even though it's probably not entirely accurate and probably a bit simplistic in that and how it approached Dalton Trumbo's life. But to me, it just made me very interested in the man and his work and his activism and all that. So, and I actually did sort of a bit of reading up on him after checking the film, because I was really interested to learn more about the guy. So, in that way, the film did its job. And as a biopic, it's not a great biopic by any means, but it's still a pretty solid and engaging one nonetheless. So, if I had to rate this film, I give it about 3.5. So, yeah, that's the end of my video review of Trumbo. I hope you guys all enjoyed it, and I'll see you all later. See you, everyone. Bye.